Chapter 21 of Wood and Garden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Janet. Wood and Garden, Notes and Thoughts, Practical and Critical, of a Working Amateur by Gertrude Jekyll. Chapter 21, Novelty and Variety. When I look back over 30 years of gardening, I see what an extraordinary progress there has been, not only in the introduction of good plants new to general cultivation, but also in the home production of improved kinds of old favorites. In annual plants alone, there has been a remarkable advance, and here again, though many really beautiful things are being brought forward, there seems always to be an undue value assigned to a fresh development on the score of its novelty. Now it seems to me that among the thousands of beautiful things already at hand for garden use, there is no merit whatever in novelty or variety, unless the thing new or different is distinctly more beautiful, or in some such way better than an older thing of the same class. And there seems to be a general wish among seed growers just now to dwarf all annual plants. Now, when a plant is naturally of a diffuse habit, the fixing of a dwarfer variety may be a distinct gain to horticulture. It may just make a good garden plant out of one that was formerly of indifferent quality. But there seems to me to be a kind of stupidity in inferring from this that all annuals are the better for dwarfing. I take it that the bedding system has had a good deal to do with it. It no doubt enables ignorant gardeners to use a larger variety of plants as senseless color masses, but it is obvious that many, if not most, of the plants are individually made much uglier by the process. Take, for example, one of the dwarfest ageratums. What a silly little dumpy formless pincushion of a thing it is! And then the dwarfest of the China asters. Here is a plant whose chief weakness already lies in a certain over-stiffness, made stiffer and more shapeless still by dwarfing and by cramming with too many petals. The comet asters of later years are a much improved type of flower, with a looser shape and a certain degree of approach to grace and beauty. When this kind came out, it was a noteworthy novelty, not because it was a novelty, but because it was a better and more beautiful thing. Also among the same asters, the introduction of a better class of red coloring, first of the blood red, then of the so-called scarlet shades, was a good variety, because it was the distinct bettering of the color of a popular race of garden flowers, whose red and pink colorings had hitherto been of a bad and rank quality. It is quite true that here and there the dwarf kind is a distinctly useful thing, as in the dwarf nasturtiums. In this grand plant one is glad to have dwarf ones, as well as the old trailing kinds. I even confess to a certain liking for the podgy little dwarf snapdragons. They are ungraceful little dumpy things, but they happen to come in some tender colorings of pale yellow and pale pink that give them a kind of absurd prettiness and a certain garden value. I also look at them as a little floral joke that is harmless and not displeasing, but they cannot for a moment compare in beauty with the free-growing snapdragon of the older type. This, I always think, one of the best and most interesting and admirable of garden plants. Its beauty is lost if it is crowded up among other things in a border. It should be grown in a dry wall or steep rocky bank, where its handsome bushy growth and finely poised spikes of bloom can be well seen. One of the annuals that I think is entirely spoilt by dwarfing is Love in a Mist, a plant I hold in high admiration. Many years ago I came upon it in a small garden of a type that I thought extremely desirable, with a double flower of just the right degree of fullness and of an unusually fine color. I was fortunate enough to get some seed, and have never grown any other, nor have I ever seen elsewhere any that I think can compare with it. The zinnia is another fine annual that has been much spoiled by its would-be improvers. When a zinnia has a hard, stiff, tall flower with a great many rows of petals piled up one on top of another, and when its habit is dwarfed to a mean degree of squatness, it looks to me both ugly and absurd, whereas a reasonably double one, well-branched, and 2 feet high, is a handsome plant. I also think that stocks and wallflowers are much handsomer when rather tall and branching. Dwarf stocks, moreover, are invariably spattered with soil in heavy autumn rain. An example of the improver not knowing where to stop in the matter of coloring always strikes me in the Gaillardias, and more especially the perennial kind that is increased by division as well as by seed. The flower is naturally of a strong orange-yellow color, with a narrow ring of red round the center. The improver has sought to increase the width of the red ring. Up to a certain point it makes a livelier and brighter-looking flower, but he has gone too far and extended the red till it has become a red flower with a narrow yellow edge. The red also is of a rather dull and heavy nature, so that instead of a handsome yellow flower with a broad central ring, here is an ugly red one with a yellow border. There is no positive harm done, as the plant has been propagated at every stage of the development, and one may choose what one will, but to see them together is an instructive lesson. No annual plant has of late years been so much improved as the sweet pea, and one reason why its charming beauty and scent are so enjoyable is that they grow tall and can be seen on a level with the eye. There can be no excuse whatever for dwarfing this, as has lately been done. There are already plenty of good flowering plants under a foot high, and the little dwarf white monstrosity, now being followed by colored ones of the same habit, seems to me worthy of nothing but condemnation. It would be as right and sensible to dwarf a hollyhock into a podgy mass, a foot high, or a penstemon, or a foxglove. Happily, these have, as yet, escaped dwarfing, though I regret to see that a deformity that not unfrequently appears among garden foxgloves, looking like a bell-shaped flower topping a stunted spike, appears to have been fixed, and is being offered as a novelty. Here is one of the clearest examples of a new development which is a distinct debasement of a naturally beautiful form, but which is nevertheless being pushed forward in trade. It has no merit whatever in itself, and is only likely to sell because it is new and curious. And all this parade of distortion and deformity comes about from the grower losing sight of beauty as the first consideration, or from his not having the knowledge that would enable him to determine what are the points of character in various plants most deserving of development, and in not knowing when or where to stop. Abnormal size, whether greatly above or much below the average, appeals to the vulgar and uneducated eye, and will always command its attention and wonderment. But then the production of the immense size that provokes astonishment, and the misapplied ingenuity that produces unusual dwarfing, are neither of them very high aims. And much as I feel grateful to those who improve garden flowers, I venture to repeat my strong conviction that their efforts in selection and other methods should be so directed as to keep in view the attainment of beauty in the first place, and as a point of honor, not to mere increase of size of bloom or compactness of habit. Many plants have been spoilt by excess of both, not for variety or novelty as ends in themselves, but only to welcome them and offer them if they are distinctly of garden value in the best sense. For if plants are grown or advertised or otherwise pushed, on any other account of that of their possessing some worthy form of beauty, they become of the same nature as any other article in trade that is got up for sale for the sole benefit of the seller, that is unduly lauded by advertisement, and that makes its first appeal to the vulgar eye by an exaggerated and showy pictorial representation. That will serve no useful purpose, and for which there is no true or healthy demand. No doubt much of it comes about from the unwholesome pressure of trade competition, which, in a way, obliges all to follow where some lead. I trust that my good many friends in the trade will understand that my remarks are not made in any personal sense whatever. I know that some of them feel as much as I do on some of these points, but in that many ways they are helpless, being all bound in a kind of bondage to the general system. And there is one great evil that calls loudly for redress, but that will endure until some of the mightiest of them have the energy and courage to band themselves together and to declare that it shall no longer exist among them. End of chapter 21. Recording by Janet, Marysville, Washington.
Chapter 22 of Wood and Garden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wood and Garden. Notes and Thoughts, Practical and Critical, of a Working Amateur, by Gertrude Jekyll. Chapter 22. Weeds and Pests. Weeding is a delightful occupation, especially after summer rain, when the roots come up clear and clean. One gets to know how many and various are the ways of weeds, as many almost as the moods of human creatures. How easy and pleasant to pull up are the soft annuals like chickweed and groundsel, and how one looks with respect at deep-rooted things like docks, that make one go and fetch a spade. Comfrey is another thing with a terrible root, and every bit must be got out, as it will grow again from the smallest scrap. And hard to get up are the two bryonies, the green and the black, with such deep-reaching roots that, if not weeded up within their first year, will have to be seriously dug out later. The white convolvulus, one of the loveliest of native plants, has a most persistently running root, of which every joint will quickly form a new plant. Some of the worst weeds to get out are goutweed and coltsfoot. Though I live on a light soil, comparatively easy to clean, I have done some gardening in clay, and well know what a despairing job it is to get the bits of either of these roots out of the stiff clods. The most persistent weed in my soil is the small running sheep sorrel. First it makes a patch, and then sends out thready running roots all round, a foot or more long. These, if not checked, establish new bases of operation, and so it goes on, always spreading farther and farther. When this happens in soft ground that can be hoed and weeded it matters less, but in the lawn it is a more serious matter. Its presence always denotes a poor sandy soil of rather a sour quality. Goutweed is a pest in nearly all gardens, and very difficult to get out. When it runs into the root of some patch of hardy plant, if the plant can be spared, I find it best to send it at once to the burn heap, or if it is too precious, there is nothing for it but to cut it all up and wash it out, to be sure that not the smallest particle of the enemy remains. Some weeds are deceiving, sow thistle for instance, which has the look of promising firm handhold and easy extraction, but has a disappointing way of almost always breaking short off at the collar. But of all the garden weeds that are native plants I know none so persistent or so insidious as the rampion bellflower, Campanula rapunculus. It grows from the smallest thread of root, and it is almost impossible to see every little bit, for though the main roots are thick and white and fleshy, the fine side roots that run far abroad are very small and of a reddish colour and easily hidden in the brown earth. But some of the worst garden weeds are exotics run wild. The common grape hyacinth sometimes overruns a garden and cannot be got rid of. Sambucus ebulis is a plant to beware of, its long thong-like roots spreading far and wide, and coming up again far away from the parent stock. For this reason it is valuable for planting in such places as newly made pond heads, helping to tie the bank together. Polygonum Sieboldi must also be planted with caution. The winter heliotrope, Petacetes fragrans, is almost impossible to get out when once it has taken hold, growing in the same way as its near relative, the native coltsfoot. But by far the most difficult plant to abolish or even keep in check that I know is Ornithogallum nutans. Beautiful as it is, and valuable as a cut flower, I will not have it in the garden. I think I may venture to say that in this soil, when once established, it cannot be eradicated. Each mature bulb makes a host of offsets, and the seed quickly ripens. When it is once in a garden it will suddenly appear in all sorts of different places. It is no use trying to dig it out. I have dug out the whole space of soil containing the patch, a barrow load at a time, and sent it to the middle of the burn heap, and put in fresh soil, and there it is again next year, nearly as thick as ever. I have dug up individual small patches with the greatest care, and got out every bulb and offset, and every bit of the whitish leaf stem, for I have such faith in its power of reproduction that I think every atom of this is capable of making a plant, only to find next year a thriving young tuft of the grass in the same place. And yet the bulb and underground stem are white, and the earth is brown, and I passed it all several times through my fingers, but all in vain. I confess that it beats me entirely. Coronilla is a little plant that appears in catalogues among desirable alpines, but is a very rooty and troublesome thing, and scarcely good enough for garden use, though pretty in a grassy bank where its rambling ways would not be objectionable. I once brought home from Brittany some roots of Linaria repens, that looked charming by a roadside, and planted them in a bit of alpine garden, a planting that I never afterwards ceased to regret. I learnt from an old farmer a good way of getting rid of a bed of nettles, to thrash them down with a stick every time they grow up. If this is done about 3 times during the year, the root becomes so much weakened that it is easily forked out, or if the treatment is gone on with, the second year the nettles die. Thrashing with a stick is better than cutting, as it makes the plant bleed more. Any mutilation of bruise or ragged tearing of fibre is more harmful to plant or tree than clean cutting. Of bird, beast, and insect pests we have plenty. First and worst are rabbits. They will gnaw and nibble anything and everything that is newly planted, even native things like juniper, Scotch fir, and gorse. The necessity of wiring everything newly planted adds greatly to the labour and expense of the garden, and the unsightly grey wire netting is an unpleasant eyesore. When plants or bushes are well established, the rabbits leave them alone, though some families of plants are always irresistible, pinks and carnations for instance, and nearly all cruciferae, such as wallflowers, stocks, and iberis. The only plants I know that they do not touch are rhododendrons and azaleas. They leave them for the hare, that is sure to get in every now and then, and who stands up on his long hind legs and will eat rose bushes quite high up. Plants eaten by a hare look as if they had been cut with a sharp knife. There is no appearance of gnawing or nibbling, no ragged edges of wood or frayed bark, but just a straight, clean cut. Field mice are very troublesome. Some years they will nibble off the flower buds of the Lent hellebores. When they do this they have a curious way of collecting them and laying them in heaps. I have no idea why they do this, as they neither carry them away nor eat them afterwards. There the heaps of buds lie till they rot or dry up. They once stole all my auricula seed in the same way. I had marked some good plants for seed, cutting off all the other flowers as soon as they went out of bloom. The seed was ripening, and I watched it daily, awaiting the moment for harvesting. But a few days before it was ready I went round and found the seed was all gone. It had been cut off at the top of the stalk, so that the umbel-shaped heads had been taken away whole. I looked about, and luckily found 3 slightly hollow places under the bank at the back of the border, where the seed heads had been piled in heaps. In this case it looked as if it had been stored for food. Luckily it was near enough to ripeness for me to save my crop. The mice are also troublesome with newly sown peas, eating some underground, while sparrows nibble off others when just sprouted, and when outdoor grapes are ripening, mice run up the walls and eat them. Even when the grapes are tied in oiled canvas bags, they will eat through the bags to get at them, though I have never known them to gnaw through the newspaper bags that I now use in preference, and that ripen the grapes as well. I am not sure whether it is mice or birds that pick off the flowers of the big bunch primroses, but am inclined to think it is mice, because the stalks are cut low down. Pheasants are very bad gardeners. What they seem to enjoy most are crocuses. In fact, it is no use planting them. I had once a nice collection of crocus species. They were in separate patches, all along the edge of one border, in a sheltered part of the garden, where pheasants did not often come. One day when I came to see my crocuses, I found, where each patch had been, a basin-shaped excavation and a few fragments of stalk or some part of the plant. They had begun at one end and worked steadily along, clearing them right out. They also destroyed a long bed of anemone fulgens. First they took the flowers, and then the leaves, and lastly pecked up and ate the roots. But we have one grand consolation in having no slugs, at least hardly any that are truly indigenous. They do not like our dry, sandy heaths. Friends are very generous in sending them with plants, so that we have a moderate number that hang about frames and pot plants, though nothing much to boast of, but they never trouble seedlings in the open ground, and for this I can never be too thankful. Alas, that the beautiful bullfinch should be so dire an enemy to fruit trees, and also the pretty little tits. But so it is, and it is a sad sight to see a well-grown fruit tree with all its fruit buds pecked out, and lying under it on the ground in a thin green carpet. We had some fine young cherry trees in a small orchard that we cut down in despair after they had been growing 12 years. They were too large to net, and their space could not be spared just for the mischievous fun of the birds. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Wood and Garden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Wood and Garden. Notes and Thoughts, Practical and Critical, of a Working Amateur, by Gertrude Jekyll. Chapter 23. The Bedding Fashion and its Influence. It is curious to look back at the old days of bedding out, when that and that only meant gardening to most people, and to remember how the fashion, beginning in the larger gardens, made its way like a great inundating wave, submerging the lesser ones, and almost drowning out the beauties of the many little flowery cottage plots of our English waysides. And one wonders how it all came about, and why the bedding system, admirable for its own purpose, should have thus outstepped its bounds, and have been allowed to run riot among gardens great and small throughout the land. But so it was, and for many years the fashion, for it was scarcely anything better, reigned supreme. It was well for all real lovers of flowers when some quarter of a century ago a strong champion of the good old flowers arose, and fought strenuously to stay the devastating tide, and to restore the healthy liking for the good old garden flowers. Many soon followed, and now one may say that all England has flocked to the standard. Bedding as an all-prevailing fashion is now dead. The old garden flowers are again honoured and loved, and every encouragement is freely offered to those who will improve old kinds and bring forward others. And now that bedding as a fashion no longer exists, one can look at it more quietly and fairly, and see what its uses really are, for in its own place and way it is undoubtedly useful and desirable. Many great country houses are only inhabited in winter, then perhaps for a week or two at Easter, and in the late summer. There is probably a house party at Easter, and a succession of visitors in the late summer. A brilliant garden, visible from the house, dressed for spring and dressed for early autumn, is exactly what is wanted, not necessarily from any special love of flowers, but as a kind of bright and well-kept furnishing of the immediate environment of the house. The gardener delights in it. It is all routine work. So many hundreds or thousands of scarlet geranium, of yellow calceolaria, of blue lobelia, of golden feverfew, or of other coloured material. It wants no imagination. The comprehension of it is within the range of the most limited understanding. Indeed, its prevalence for some 20 years or more must have had a deteriorating influence on the whole class of private gardeners, presenting to them an ideal so easy of attainment and so cheap of mental effort. But bedding, though it is gardening of the least poetical or imaginative kind, can be done badly or beautifully. In the parterre of the formal garden it is absolutely in place, and brilliantly beautiful pictures can be made by a wise choice of colouring. I once saw, and can never forget, a bedded garden that was a perfectly satisfying example of colour harmony, but then it was planned by the master, a man of the most refined taste, and not by the gardener. It was a parterre that formed part of the garden in one of the fine old places in the Midland counties. I have no distinct recollection of the design, except that there was some principle of fan-shaped radiation, of which each extreme angle formed one centre. The whole garden was treated in one harmonious colouring of full yellow, orange, and orange-brown, half-hardy annuals, such as French and African marigolds, zinnias, and nasturtiums, being freely used. It was the most noble treatment of one limited range of colouring I have ever seen in a garden, brilliant without being garish, and sumptuously gorgeous without the reproach of gaudiness, a precious lesson in temperance and restraint in the use of the one colour, and an admirable exposition of its powerful effect in the hands of a true artist. I think that in many smaller gardens a certain amount of bedding may be actually desirable, for where the owner of a garden has a special liking for certain classes or mixtures of plants, or wishes to grow them thoroughly well and enjoy them individually to the full, he will naturally grow them in separate beds, or may intentionally combine the beds, if he will, into some form of good garden effect. But the great fault of the bedding system when at its height was that it swept over the country as a tyrannical fashion, that demanded, and for the time being succeeded in effecting, the exclusion of better and more thoughtful kinds of gardening, for I believe I am right in saying that it spread like an epidemic disease, and raged far and wide for nearly a quarter of a century. Its worst form of all was the ribbon border, generally a line of scarlet geranium at the back, then a line of calceolaria, then a line of blue lobelia, and lastly a line of the inevitable golden feather feverfew, or what our gardener used to call featherfew. Could anything be more tedious or more stupid? And the ribbon border was at its worst when its lines were not straight, but waved about in weak and silly sinuations. And when bedding as a fashion was dead, when this false god had been toppled off his pedestal, and his worshippers had been converted to better beliefs, in turning and rending him they often went too far, and did injustice to the innocent by professing a dislike to many a good plant, and renouncing its use. It was not the fault of the geranium or of the calceolaria that they had been grievously misused and made to usurp too large a share of our garden spaces. Not once but many a time my visitors have expressed unbounded surprise when they saw these plants in my garden, saying, "I should have thought that you would have despised geraniums." On the contrary, I love geraniums. There are no plants to come near them for pot, or box, or stone basket, or for massing in any sheltered place in hottest sunshine, and I love their strangely pleasant smell, and their beautiful modern colourings of soft scarlet and salmon pink, some of these grouping beautifully together. I have a space in connection with some formal stonework of steps, and tank, and paved walks, close to the house, on purpose for the summer placing of large pots of geranium, with sometimes a few cannas and lilies. For a quarter of the year it is one of the best things in the garden, and delightful in colour. Then no plant does so well or looks so suitable in some earthen pots and boxes from southern Italy that I always think the best that were ever made, their shape and well-designed ornament traditional from the Middle Ages, and probably from an even more remote antiquity. There are, of course, among bedding geraniums many of a bad, raw quality of colour, particularly among cold, hard pinks, but there are so many to choose from that these can easily be avoided. I remember some years ago, when the bedding fashion was going out, reading some rather heated discussions in the gardening papers about methods of planting out and arranging various tender but indispensable plants. Someone who had been writing about the errors of the bedding system wrote about planting some of these in isolated masses. He was pounced upon by another, who asked, "What is this but bedding?" The second writer was so far justified, in that it cannot be denied that any planting in beds is bedding. But then there is bedding and bedding, a right and a wrong way of applying the treatment. Another matter that roused the combative spirit of the captious critic was the filling up of bare spaces in mixed borders with geraniums, calceolarias, and other such plants. Again he said, "What is this but bedding? These are bedding plants." When I read this, it seemed to me that his argument was, these plants may be very good plants in themselves, but because they have for some years been used wrongly, therefore they must not now be used rightly. In the case of my own visitors, when they have expressed surprise at my having "those horrid old bedding plants" in my garden, it seemed quite a new view when I pointed out that bedding plants were only passive agents in their own misuse, and that a geranium was a geranium long before it was a bedding plant. But the discussion raised in my mind a wish to come to some conclusion about the difference between bedding in the better and worse sense, in relation to the cases quoted, and it appeared to me to be merely in the choice between right and wrong placing monotonously or stupidly, so as merely to fill the space, or placing with a feeling for drawing or proportion. For I had very soon found out that if I had a number of things to plant anywhere, whether only to fill up a border or as a detached group, if I placed the things myself, carefully exercising what power of discrimination I might have acquired, it looked fairly right, but that if I left it to one of my garden people, a thing I rarely do, it looked all nohow, or like bedding in the worst sense of the word. Even the better ways of gardening do not wholly escape the debasing influence of fashion. Wild gardening is a delightful, and in good hands a most desirable pursuit, but no kind of gardening is so difficult to do well, or is so full of pitfalls and of paths of peril. Because it has in some measure become fashionable, and because it is understood to mean the planting of exotics in wild places, unthinking people rush to the conclusion that they can put any garden plants into any wild places, and that that is wild gardening. I have seen woody places that were already perfect with their own simple charm just muddled and spoilt by a reckless planting of garden refuse, and heathy hillsides already sufficiently and beautifully clothed with native vegetation made to look lamentably silly by the planting of a nurseryman's mixed lot of exotic conifers. In my own case I have always devoted the most careful consideration to any bit of wild gardening I thought of doing, never allowing myself to decide upon it till I felt thoroughly assured that the place seemed to ask for the planting in contemplation, and that it would be distinctly a gain in pictorial value. So there are stretches of daffodils in one part of the copse, while another is carpeted with lily of the valley. A cool bank is covered with gaultheria, and just where I thought they would look well as little jewels of beauty are spreading patches of trillium and the great yellow dog-tooth violet. Besides these there are only some groups of the giant lily. Many other exotic plants could have been made to grow in the wooded ground, but they did not seem to be wanted. I thought where the copse looked well and complete in itself, it was better left alone. But where the wood joins the garden some bold groups of flowering plants are allowed, as of mullein in one part and foxglove in another. for when standing in the free part of the garden it is pleasant to project the sight far into the wood, and to let the garden influences penetrate here and there, the better to join the one to the other. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Wood and Garden. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Wood and Garden. Notes and Thoughts, Practical and Critical, of a Working Amateur, by Gertrude Jekyll. Chapter 24. Masters and Men. Now that the owners of good places are for the most part taking a newly awakened and newly educated pleasure in the better ways of gardening, a frequent source of difficulty arises from the ignorance and obstructiveness of gardeners. The owners have become aware that their gardens may be sources of the keenest pleasure. The gardener may be an excellent man, perfectly understanding the ordinary routine of garden work. He may have been many years in his place. It is his settled home, and he is getting well on into middle life. But he has no understanding of the new order of things. And when the master, perfectly understanding what he is about, desires that certain things shall be done, and wishes to enjoy the pleasure of directing the work himself, and seeing it grow under his hand, he resents it as an interference, and becomes obstructive, or does what is required in a spirit of such sullen acquiescence that it is equal to open opposition. And I have seen so many gardens and gardeners that I have come to recognize certain types, and this one, among men of a certain age, is unfortunately frequent. Various degrees of ignorance and narrow-mindedness must no doubt be expected among the class that produces private gardeners. Their general education is not very wide to begin with, and their training is usually all in one groove, and the many who possess a full share of vanity get to think that, because they have exhausted the obvious sources of experience that have occurred within their reach, there is nothing more to learn, or to know, or to see, or to feel, or to enjoy. It is in this that the difficulty lies. The man has, no doubt, done his best through life. He has performed his duties well and faithfully, and can render a good account of his stewardship. It is no fault of his that more means of enlarging his mind have not been within his grasp, and to a certain degree he may be excused for not understanding that there is anything beyond. But if he is naturally vain and stubborn, his case is hopeless. If, on the other hand, he is wise enough to know that he does not know everything, and modest enough to acknowledge it, as do all the greatest and most learned of men, he will then be eager to receive new and enlarged impressions, and his willing and intelligent co-operation will be a new source of interest in life, both to himself and his employer, as well as a fresh spring of vitality in the life of the garden. I am speaking of the large middle class of private gardeners, not of those of the highest rank, who have among them men of good education and a large measure of refinement. From among these I think of the late Mr. Ingram of the Belvoir Castle Gardens, with regret as for a personal friend, and also as of one who was a true garden artist. But most people who have fair-sized gardens have to do with the middle class of gardener, the man of narrow mental training. The master who, after a good many years of active life, is looking forward to settling in his home and improving and enjoying his garden, has had so different a training, a course of teaching so immeasurably wider and more enlightening. As a boy he was in a great public school, where by wholesome friction with his fellows he had any petty or personal nonsense knocked out of him while still in his early teens. Then he goes to college, and whether studiously inclined or not, he is already in the great world, always widening his ideas and experience. Then perhaps he is in one of the active professions, or engaged in scientific or intellectual research, or in diplomacy, his ever-expanding intelligence rubbing up against all that is most enlightened and astute in men, or most profoundly inexplicable in matter. He may be at the same time cultivating his taste for literature and the fine arts, searching the libraries and galleries of the civilized world for the noblest and most divinely inspired examples of human work, seeing with an eye that daily grows more keenly searching, and receiving and holding with a brain that ever gains a firmer grasp, and so acquires some measure of the higher critical faculty. He sees the ruined gardens of antiquity, colossal works of the rulers of imperial Rome, and the later gardens of the Middle Ages, direct descendants of those greater and older ones, some of them still among the most beautiful gardens on earth. He sees how the taste for gardening grew and travelled, spreading through Europe and reaching England, first, no doubt, through her Roman invaders. He becomes more and more aware of what great and enduring happiness may be enjoyed in a garden, and how all that he can learn of it in the leisure intervals of his earlier maturity, and then in middle life, will help to brighten his later days, when he hopes to refine and make better the garden of the old home by a reverent application of what he has learnt. He thinks of the desecrated old bowling green, cut up to suit the fashion of 30 years ago into a patchwork of incoherent star and crescent-shaped beds, of how he will give it back its ancient character of unbroken repose. He thinks how he will restore the string of fish-ponds in the bottom of the wooded valley just below, now a rushy meadow with swampy hollows that once were ponds, and humpy mounds, ruins of the ancient dykes, of how the trees will stand reflected in the still water, and how he will live to see again in middle hours of summer days, as did the monks of old, the broad backs of the golden carp basking just below the surface of the sun-warmed water. And such a man as this comes home some day and finds the narrow-minded gardener, who believes that he already knows all that can be known about gardening, who thinks that the merely technical part, which he perfectly understands, is all that there is to be known and practised, and that his crude ideas about arrangement of flowers are as good as those of anyone else. And a man of this temperament cannot be induced to believe, and still less can he be made to understand, that all that he knows is only the means to a further and higher end, and that what he can show of a completed garden can only reach to an average dead level of dullness compared with what may come of the life-giving influence of one who has the mastery of the higher garden knowledge. Moreover, he either forgets or does not know what is the main purpose of a garden, namely, that it is to give its owner the best and highest kind of earthly pleasure. Neither is he enlightened enough to understand that the master can take a real and intelligent interest in planning and arranging, and in watching the working out in detail. His small-minded vanity can only see in all this a distrust in his own powers, and an intentional slight cast on his ability, whereas no such idea had ever entered the master's mind. Though there are many of this kind of gardener, and with their employers, if they have the patience to retain them in their service, I sincerely condole, There are, happily, many of a widely different nature, whose minds are both supple and elastic and intelligently receptive, who are eager to learn and to try what has not yet come within the range of their experience, who show a cheerful readiness to receive a fresh range of ideas, and a willing alacrity in doing their best to work them out. Such a servant as this warms his master's heart, and it would do him good to hear, as I have many times heard, the terms in which the master speaks of him. For just as the educated man feels contempt for the vulgar pretension that goes with any exhibition of ignorant vanity, so the evidence of the higher qualities commands his respect and warm appreciation. Among the gardeners I have known, 5 such men come vividly to my recollection. Good men all, with a true love of flowers, and its reflection of happiness written on their kindly faces. But then, on the other hand, frequent causes of irritation arise between master and man from the master's ignorance and unreasonable demands. For much as the love of gardening has grown of late, there are many owners who have no knowledge of it whatever. I have more than once had visitors who complained of their gardeners, as I thought quite unreasonably, on their own showing. For it is not enough to secure the services of a thoroughly able man, and to pay good wages, and to provide every sort of appliance, if there is no reasonable knowledge of what it is right and just to expect. I have known a lady, after paying a round of visits in great houses, complain of her gardener. She had seen at one place remarkably fine forced strawberries, at another some phenomenal frame violets, and at a third immense Malmaison carnations, whereas her own gardener did not excel in any of these, though she admitted that he was admirable for grapes and chrysanthemums. If the others could do all these things to perfection, she argued, why could not he do them? She expected her gardener to do equally well all that she had seen best done in the other big places. It was in vain that I pleaded in defence of her man that all gardeners were human creatures, and that it was in the nature of such creatures to have individual aptitudes and special preferences, and that it was to be expected that each man should excel in one thing, or one thing at a time, and so on. But it was of no use, and she would not accept any excuse or explanation. I remember another example of a visitor who had a rather large place, and a gardener who had as good a knowledge of hardy plants as one could expect. My visitor had lately got the idea that he liked hardy flowers, though he had scarcely thrown off the influence of some earlier heresy which taught that they were more or less contemptible, the sort of thing for cottage gardens. Still, as they were now in fashion, he thought he had better have them. We were passing along my flower border, just then in one of its best moods of summer beauty, and when its main occupants, 3 years planted, had come to their full strength, when, speaking of a large flower border he had lately had made, he said, "I told my fellow last autumn to get anything he liked, and yet it is perfectly wretched. It is not as if I wanted anything out of the way. I only want a lot of common things like that," waving a hand airily at my precious border, while scarcely taking the trouble to look at it. And I have had another visitor of about the same degree of appreciative insight, who, contemplating some cherished garden picture, the consummation of some long-hoped-for wish, the crowning joy of years of labour, said, "Now look at that! It is just right, and yet it is quite simple. There is absolutely nothing in it. Now why can't my man give me that?" I am far from wishing to disparage or undervalue the services of the honest gardener, but I think that on this point there ought to be the clearest understanding. that the master must not expect from the gardener accomplishments that he has no means of acquiring, and that the gardener must not assume that his knowledge covers all that can come within the scope of the widest and best practice of his craft. There are branches of education, entirely out of his reach, that can be brought to bear upon garden planning and arrangement down to the very least detail. What the educated employer, who has studied the higher forms of gardening, can do or criticise, he cannot be expected to do or understand. It is in itself almost the work of a lifetime, and only attainable, like success in any other fine art, by persons of firstly special temperament and aptitude, and secondly by their unwearied study and closest application. But the result of knowledge so gained shows itself throughout the garden. It may be in so simple a thing as the placing of a group of plants. They can be so placed by the hand that knows that the group is in perfect drawing in relation to what is near, while by the ordinary gardener they would be so planted that they look absurd, or unmeaning, or in some way awkward and unsightly. It is not enough to cultivate plants well, they must also be used well. The servant may set up the canvas and grind the colours, and even set the palette, but the master alone can paint the picture. It is just the careful and thoughtful exercise of the higher qualities that makes a garden interesting, and their absence that leaves it blank and dull and lifeless. I am heartily in sympathy with the feeling described in these words in a friend's letter. I think there are few things so interesting as to see in what way a person whose perceptions you think fine and worthy of study will give them expression in a garden. End of chapter 24. Recording by Ruth Golding. End of Wood and Garden by Gertrude Jekyll.